started teaching English quite a few years ago, and with a very basic understanding of how language fits into the kind of management of classrooms, and obviously there's sort of negotiations and interactions that go on in those kinds of English language settings. And so with my very basic knowledge, I then went off and started teaching English in very interesting places around the world. And I think it was after a few years of starting to realize how different kinds of English, different varieties of English had different kinds of power in different settings. That was where my initial interest in sociolinguistics, I guess, came from, without really knowing what sociolinguistics was, because I was an English literature undergraduate student, and so I didn't get a chance to explore some of these things till a little bit later on. But I guess it was always there when you teach English, with things like native speaker norms and different kinds of ideas around prescriptivism, what's correct, what isn't correct, and how do we manage that in classrooms. So those those issues around language ideologies were always of interest to me, but I guess I didn't know really how to explore them and analyze them and work with them until I started to read more around discourse, classroom discourse, and then discourse analysis as a way of assembling tools to sort of analyze the kinds of interactions that I'd become very familiar with. So it was a few years after teaching English that I actually became able to sort of identify the authors that I was interested in, that would allow me to then, explore some of these classroom interaction patterns and the kind of power relations that shape those classroom interactional patterns. So once I'd worked out what sociolinguistics was, I guess then I started to think about doing an MA, looking at the kinds of opportunities to bring in more theory and more research to help me understand the kinds of classrooms that I was working in. By this stage, I'd started working on teacher education and teacher development, mainly in ODA development settings. So a very different set of circumstances when you start to identify what is the role of English in the reconstruction of Cambodia in the early 90s. And a few years later, working in Pakistan. Again, English is the official language in Pakistan. So it's an important subject at schools. It's also the medium of instruction in many schools. So trying to use theories, concepts from sociolinguistics to understand those kinds of very practical realities when different languages come together in classroom settings. I carried out doctoral research working with migrant families, recent migrants, but recent migrants who were part of several generations of what was then called chain migration. So migrants who were arriving in the UK, this was around 2010, but were part of families who first arrived in the UK in the 1950s. And it was really interesting to look at how people talked about the importance of English when they first arrived, and now how that's changed considerably, considering how English has become a gatekeeping device and presents lots of constraints as well as opportunities. So it was looking at the role of English primarily, but then needing to understand English within the wider multilingual context of working with migrant families from Pakistan. So what role these were people who used Punjabi at home and a little bit of Urdu. So again, locating English within these multilingual repertoires of migrant families and how that plays out, not just in classrooms, but how that plays out in family life. And I've been very fortunate to be part of several policy level interventions, which sociolinguists trying to explain the complexities of people's multilingual repertoires, whilst always drawing attention to the fact that English is still important, but it's only one of the varieties that's used alongside people's other linguistic resources. So the impact, really, it depends on who your stakeholder group is. I've worked with teachers, and I've designed materials for teacher training projects. The impact there, I think, is more tangible because, again, I've been fortunate enough to design materials for classroom use. So I think if you can work with teachers who have a responsibility to their learners, and you're able to work with them on some kinds of multilingual pedagogy to see, help them see the benefits of drawing on these rich linguistic resources, then the impact in classrooms is quite significant. Just one individual teacher using some of these strategies can then transform their classroom teaching and start to kind of counter some of the very kind of um, English dominant narratives and discourses. So impact at the classroom level, there's often impact at policy level. I've worked with British Council Pakistan for several years now, and I'm currently working on a project where we are designing classroom materials for teachers, but at the provincial level. So we do have a classroom research project, but we're also working with decision makers, language planners, curriculum designers, British Council staff, who ultimately need to be able to advocate for these multilingual ways of working. So I hope the impact there is above the classroom level, and perhaps at the policy level. Another quick example is I did quite a big piece of research a few years ago with colleagues looking at language education in the countries neighboring Syria. And what we were able to articulate was a role for all of the languages that migrants and forced migrants, refugees, and internally displaced people, all of the resources that they take with them when they migrate are significant in the ways that they then build a new home and get to know their neighbors and fit into their language or lessons or wider schooling. So I guess there the impact was not identifying one particular language variety, such as English, but taking a very multilingual approach and identifying roles for the different languages that people take with them. So the impact there is helping teachers and policymakers to see that there are different ways of working with different languages.